Alright, so in this lesson we're going to take a look at optimizing terrain and how it works. Now this is going to be a relatively quick lesson, just sort of showing you a few things that you should keep in mind when you're trying to make your terrain behave in, well, I hate to use the term again, but a more optimized, more efficient manner inside of your levels.
Right, so what we're going to do is I've moved the spawn point back over to that wall so we can easily see part of the terrain behind this wall as it gets occluded when we run back and forth, just to show off a certain size. Now, I know we were just playing it, but this time I want to point out a certain option first. I'm going to use the search for actors and just type in T, so I bring up my only terrain info in the level.
Cool.
And with it selected now, I can go to its properties, or if I double-click it first, so...
There you go.
Select it, and let me move the camera back a little. Got the terrain info. Terrain sector size. Right now I've got this set down to 2. It generally defaults to about 16.
Okay.
Now, what terrain sector size does is this controls the chunks of terrain that will disappear as when it goes to decide what's visible or not. Let me actually load the game and explain what I mean.
Okay.
When you're optimizing terrain, of course, the entire terrain can't be hidden or visible unless it's way off in its own zone. That just wouldn't be efficient.
Right.
It's set up so that sectors of the terrain can disappear one by one as parts of the terrain become occluded.
Okay.
With the default setting of 16 means the terrain's going to disappear in blocks of 16 by 16 quads. So if I go into R mode 1 with the terrain sector size set to 16, see the terrain in the distance, how entire chunks of it disappear and reappear as I walk back and forth?
Right.
Now, I know this is going to be a few quick game launch tests, but let me bring that down to 8 and test with that.
Okay.
That's why I moved the player start over so we don't have to keep running over there every time.
No, that makes sense.
So again, terrain sector size set to 8, and you see that it disappears in smaller chunks.
Right, so you're kind of changing the resolution of how much the thing is optimized.
Or just how it's deciding what parts should and should not be shown.
Right, okay. Like how large of a chunk is going to disappear when it becomes occluded.
That's right.
Okay.
So setting it all the way down to 2 will still work. Mode 1. And now check it out. The only thing, though, is now you may be wondering, like, why would you want to adjust the setting? Because in the end, you're always going to see the terrain if you're looking at it.
Right.
The reason is this can changing the way it decides what parts of the terrain are occluded. You may run into a worse performance issue if you set it way down so that almost every individual quad has to be looked at. You'll end up spending more time, or the engine will end up spending more time deciding which piece is visible than it would if it was to render, say, an extra couple of quads.
Okay.
Meaning if you set it to 2, every 2 quads, it's going to have to check. Should this draw? Yes, no. Should this one draw? Yes or no? And then that eats up processing power.
So the idea is to test it out and find sort of a happy medium in between, like, your sizes.
So starting off at the base of 16, see how it runs. Maybe make it a little larger if your level is, if there's like larger chunks that can be blocked off to your level, or maybe make it smaller in some cases.
Right.
It just depends on the way the map's set up.
Okay.
So that's pretty much all we need to look at just as a setting, just to keep that in mind when working with terrain in reference to optimization. One last thing I want to look at is just a quick tip, and you may already be aware of this, but I took the Antlis map and I repainted the visibility on all the corners. In the original map, they took all... let me wander around for just a moment back to where my camera was. Of course, it got snapped when I selected that terrain zone info.
Right.
So let me just slowly wander over back to what I'll call my corner of the map for the time being. So if I zoom out of the level, maybe turn static meshes off, and check out on the edge, see how this terrain that's pretty much never going to be seen ever by the player?
Yeah.
Instead of letting the sector size decide and making sure we have anti-portals everywhere, what we can do is actually go back into the terrain editing dialog with this terrain selected and grab the visibility tool. You may have, if you've used terrain, you're familiar with this when trying to cut into part of a level. So you want to bore into the terrain so you can make a room inside of it.
Right.
Well, one of the things about a quad of terrain once it's been marked invisible is then obviously it doesn't render anymore. So if I was to grab all these off to the corner here, hold Control and right-click, and start painting them out, then that automatically marks these as never drawn. So we don't have to worry about anything including at all or any occlusion calculations at all, really.
So if you're never going to see it, you might as well paint it to be invisible.
Right. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to toggle the static meshes on and off, because you notice that it was kind of obvious that some of that stuff was never going to be drawn. But if we look at this, everything in here. All these walls of terrain basically are never going to be seen. So if I let me bring the outer radius in a little bit so I can more carefully paint these out. Now this is a process that can become a little bit tedious, as you have to make sure you don't accidentally erase too far, see a gap inside the level.
Right.
But let me just catch this one corner. Of course it'd take a while, but it's the exact same process all the way around the level. So paint some of these out. Maybe just something like that.
And while this may not seem like much, I mean, eventually you're going to run into levels that are so big where these triangles are really going to add up.
Right, and making sure that anything that you can't visibly see, because that's one of the cool things about terrain, is if there's any part of it that will never be seen,
right.
It's very easy for you to just mark every part of it out that you can't see. And then that automatically helps with your render times, as you've manually specified as that part of the terrain simply doesn't render. No calculations necessary.
Awesome.
R mode 1, and check that out. See, before, when it's deciding the sector size, even though I have it set low to 2, for performance sake, I would want to set that up to at least 8 probably. Even 16
right.
might run faster. But check it out. Of course, we've marked all those, and there's 2 more jagged ones we could hide. But it's never going to have to calculate those. It's never going to have to worry about them. So a big speed increase right there.
Very cool.
Of course, if we zoom out of Mantis again, that's only the very tip of the iceberg as far as all that we could do.
Right. I mean, we could go through there and we could cover up a lot of this terrain.
But that's the same principle. That's the effect you're going to achieve, is anything that you don't need to see just doesn't need to be rendered.
There you go.
So with that, that's pretty much going to wrap up the just a few tips I wanted to point out on terrain optimization.
Cool. So, as I mentioned earlier, a bit of a short lesson, but get some good points across about how you can make terrain work more efficiently for your level. So, thanks a lot.